It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the keynote talk opening this year's postgraduate certificate in ecological survey techniques. I am Joanna Bagniewska. I'm the co-director of the program. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote, the author and ecologist, Tom Moorhouse. Tom has spent about 20 years at Oxford University at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, where he's been researching all sorts of species, mainly to do with water, but not only. So he's been looking at water voles and at crayfish, signal crayfish. And then he moved on to slightly broader topics such as wildlife trade, but he also has a very soft spot for hedgehogs. And when it comes to his other hat, he does a lot of writing, and that's for both children and adults. I wholeheartedly recommend his book, Elegy for a River. If this is a career choice that you would like to make, if you want to be an ecologist or a conservationist, it's definitely a must read for you. And there's also another book that Tom has literally published last year, was it? I think so. Hedgehog Who Done It. I have a copy here. If you don't trust me, you can have a flick through the book and see for yourself. Okay, I think without further ado, it's my pleasure to have Tom here. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Joanna. So what I intend to do this evening is to start a talk with a bunch of caveats, which is always a good start. Shows you're really confident in your subject area. I go to caveat this by saying that this is my lived experience of doing conservation research, and therefore it's my opinion of conservation. And I'll be talking a lot about my own research, which is not to say my research is fantastically brilliant. I think it was perfectly fine. But what I do think is that my research came along at about the right time for to sort of encompass a transition that's occurred in the field of sort of academic research into conservation. When I started my PhD, which is on water voles, it was 1999. And a lot of people were involved with single species conservation. So there's a species that has a conservation problem. The idea was that you would go and you would do research on that species, you'd work out what the problem is, and once you've got the problem nailed down, you know what the solution is, then the problem gets fixed. That was the mindset at the time. And as I say, my research kind of came along pretty much, I think it's fair to say that very, very few of these single species conservation problems had ever been truly fixed or been sorted out. And I just so happened to be working on water voles with a whole bunch of other researchers up and down Britain at about the time when we figured it out. And so at the end of my research, we pretty much knew what we had to do to save water voles. And so it became a very interesting insight into what happens if you actually do solve a single species conservation problem. So that's a water vole, which is the best way to start a talk because it gets everybody on site immediately because they are extremely cute and fluffy. This is a water vole in its natural habitat, perched on top of a Pringles tube. There is a very good reason for putting a water vole on top of the Pringles tube. Does anybody know why you put a water vole on a Pringles tube? Out of interest, yeah?
It's hatched out of it, so we can weigh it.
You're very, yeah. It turns out Pringles tubes are the most fantastically useful way to handle water voles because this is an animal, as you'll see, that when it's nervous or frightened, it runs through a burrow, and a Pringles tube is exactly the same diameter as a water vole's burrow. And so basically, if you want to handle a water vole, you point a Pringles tube, preferably empty, at its head, and it will climb in. And then you got water vole in tube, you can weigh them, you can measure them. And we discovered this after I'd been doing, so I did my PhD on water voles, and for 4 years, I was emptying out traps into nets and getting bitten and urinated on. And then these things come along, and it turns out that all of that work had been unnecessary. You just need to point a Pringles tube at their heads. The first time I did it, I forgot to clean the Pringles tube first, and it came out. The water vole acts like a bottle brush, and it came out covered in salt and vinegar flavored crisp dust, and not looking particularly jovial like. Anyway, so that's a water vole. It's this is Wind in the Willows. That is ratty, badger, mole, toad, and loads of stoats and weasels running for their life. Water voles are ratty from Wind in the Willows. Wind in the Willows was published in 1908. Water voles are also water rats. What they are not are these things. This is a brown rat. And a brown rat is a very different animal. Brown rats have been in the UK for probably something like 400 years. They're originally, I think, from sort of way over sort of Eastern Europe and the borders of Asia. And they kind of spread across Europe. And as you can see, they've got a very pointy nose. You can see there's big ears sticking out the fur, and they've got a very sort of shiny tail without a lot of hair on them. They often get confused for water voles. These are the things, if you've got rats in your house, they're everywhere, as I'm sure you know. They're very different from these things, which have been in the UK for 14,000 years. You can see they don't have such a pointy nose. You can't really see any ears sticking out the fur, and you can't really see the tail there, but it's also very, very furry. You can tell the difference if you're trapping them. I've caught both water voles and rats accidentally. If you open a trap with a water vole in, it curls up and does that and waits for you to go away. If you open up a trap with a rat in, it's out of there and headbutting you and kind of scrabbling at your face and trying to get out of there. A very different attitude towards life. So water voles live in places like this. This is the Wendover arm of the Grand Union Canal, which is about an hour's drive that away. It's got lots of deep, slow-flowing water, lots of plants growing up out of it, lots of plants growing up out of the banks, and the banks are sort of high and they're made of mud into which the water voles burrow. They also live in places like this. These are two marshes I worked in. And again, you've got deep, slow-flowing water. You've got lots and lots of emergent vegetation, lots of high banks for the voles to dig in. So this is essentially what a water vole wants out of life. They want banks in which to build a burrow system, deep, slow-flowing water, because they essentially use that as an escape mechanism, as I'll show you in a second. And they want lots and lots and lots of vegetation, because they spend most of their lives stuffing their fluffy faces as full of food as they can possibly get them. They're about that big. And everything else that's about that big eats really high quality food. They eat nuts and seeds. Water voles eat, for the reasons best known to themselves, basically leafy vegetation, which makes them really small cows, but without all those stomachs. So they have to eat constantly every 4 hours just to keep themselves on their feet. You know if you've got a water vole around because they leave piles of stuff where they've been feeding. And you also know if they're around because they leave piles of droppings, latrines, and those droppings are territorial marking. They're left by the females particularly on an outcrop, and they have flank glands here. And they leave a big pile of droppings on a prominent position, and they scrape their hind feet down the flank glands and drum the droppings flat, and that says there's a water vole lives here, keep out. And when you go home tonight, I want you to have a look at your front door and be very, very grateful that you don't have to do that to keep people out of your house. But it does work. I tried it. And so what female water voles want out of life is a length of riverbank to call their own. And that contains all of the nesting sites, all of the food they need to raise pups. And at the beginning of the breeding season, there aren't many water voles around. Their numbers are very low, and that's about April when the vegetation starts growing up. And a female may have about 300 meters of riverbank all to herself. As she starts breeding, her female daughters, as opposed to other sexes of daughter, her daughters will inherit some of the territory. Males come and go. And as they start sort of taking bits of territories get smaller and smaller and smaller as the numbers of water voles go up and up and up across the breeding season. And at the end of the breeding season, females have territories that are about 50 meters long. And there's a whole bunch of really cool feedback mechanisms that mean that their offspring grow slower, and therefore the population reaches population rate sort of rates of increase. You reach an asymptote, which I don't have time to go into, but you can take it as read. It's really cool. So that's great. So as I said, these guys have been around for 14,000 years. And that is despite being right at the business end of the food chain. So every single time a water vole steps outside of its burrow, and even when it's in its burrow, it's waiting to be got by something. If it's attacked by a fox, it has an excellent defense mechanism. It jumps into the water, hits the surface, dives down, and kicks up a cloud of sediment. And it's almost impossible to see where they've gone. Victorian naturalists used to think that they dived in and just held onto plants at the bottom until the predator had gone away. Because Victorian naturalists weren't always the most sort of rigorous or methodical. But what they actually do is they swim down the river and they have escape hatches that lead into tunnels in the bank further down, and then they sort of climb out and they're inside the bank. Likewise, if they're attacked by a heron, you get herons. I remember being in one of those marshes I showed you, and they just dredged one of the banks and they dumped a load of weeds on the bank, and there are herons every 5 meters down the bank waiting for a water vole to come out so they can whack it. But again, herons can't dive into the water after them, and they can't fit down the burrow. Similarly with owls. Stoats and weasels can fit down water voles' burrows after them, but again, they have those escape hatches that go into the water, and stoats and weasels can't follow them there. And even when they're in the water, there are fish like pike waiting to take them. So water voles have an incredibly dangerous life. And what's quite incredible is if you're lucky enough to watch a water vole, they look fantastically relaxed. They're kind of swimming around and they're carrying things in their mouths, having a bit of a groom. But the second there's any sign of danger, they're gone. And for 14,000 years, a whole suite of predators has been eating water voles. And what happens over the course of the breeding season is that the numbers go up and up and up and up. And then you get to the point in the year when there isn't enough food for the females to keep breeding from October onwards. And there's no more increase. And you get a massive decrease in the population. You lose 75% of the water voles over winter. So there's only 25% of them left by the time you get to the next April, and they can start breeding again. And they breed so fantastically quickly. Does anybody want to hazard a guess how many pups a female water vole can have in 6 months? That's go on, be brave. No. Good guess. It's too few. She can have 6 litters of 6. Basically, she can have 1 litter of pups every month for 6 months with 6 pups. But the pups born in April can be grown up and have their own litters by June. And the pups born in June can be grown up and have their own litters by September. So 2 water voles can turn themselves into hundreds of water voles very, very, very quickly. And I've given similar talks to sort of modern day school kids. And at this point in the talk, I say, okay, now has anybody seen a water vole? And maybe 2 or 3 hands go up. And that's a very, very, very sad thing, because if I could go back in time and ask the parents of those kids, like my generation now, has anyone seen a water vole? It would be maybe 10% of the room would put their hands up. If you could go back to my parents' generation, it would be about half the room. Go back to my grandparents' generation, it would be the whole room would have seen a water vole. And pretty much for the entire duration of human colonization of the British Isles, water voles and humans have coexisted. We're talking 10,000 years in which everybody's lived experience is if you went for a walk down the Thames, near a pond, down a canal, near any structure with water, you would have just seen them. They were there. There was something small that gave a little bit of joy to your life. And they're almost gone in a very, very, very short period of time. And this is a rodent. They breed like rodents and have incredible defense mechanisms that have lasted them for, 14,000 years. So what went wrong? Well, you would think that everybody would notice very quickly when a very common animal starts going extinct. And in fact, it wasn't really until the 1980s when people started to think, hey, we started getting local reports, and these are like reports from the local parish council or from a naturalist group in Peterborough or something along those lines, saying, we haven't seen as many water voles this year. And that was in the 1980s. And so there was possibly the most methodologically dodgy study I've ever come across in my entire life, but still, which is still, frankly, incredibly important, came out, where what they did was, in this particular study, they went back through the literature and all the reports they could find for going back to the 1900s of reports of water voles, and just basically just recorded the number of times they were described as common, as opposed to rare or something like that. And they found that it had gone down. And so that's about as dodgy as it gets. But it stimulated a national survey. Now, this is not the case that, I should probably also, it's not the case that what happened was we got a few of these reports and the Environment Agency or any of the statutory bodies went, oh my goodness, we're losing an incredibly common and much loved species. What we need is a national survey of water voles. What happened is an eccentric philanthropist who happened to be crazy about wildlife, the Right Honourable Vincent Weir, funded our friend and colleague Rob Strachan to undertake a national survey of water voles. And that was in the 1990s. And then that national survey was repeated later in the 1990s by his brother, Chris. And without that intervention, we would have had no data whatsoever, except for this study and a few others saying that water voles had declined. And that's something to bear in mind about how piecemeal conservation can be, especially at the outset of finding out that a species is in decline. And right at the beginning, all sorts of people coming up with all sorts of ridiculous ideas for what it could be. Could it be pollution? No, it's not really pollution. Their life cycle is way too short for it to be pollution. Somebody said it was owls, which if you think about it for 5 seconds, you'd have to see a population explosion of owls, the likes of which it would have to be a plague of owls, and they, eating fantastic numbers of water voles. It wasn't owls. What it was this thing here, which is a North American mink, the name suggesting that it's not native to this country. So these guys were brought over. I see we've lost the next slide, but never mind. So these guys were brought over in the 1920s for fur farming, because in the 1920s, the fashionable ladies in the UK used to like to wear long fur coats, and you need something long and furry to make long fur coats out of, and the poor American mink was the thing. And they got out, and they kept getting out, and they kept getting out, but they never really got established. And the next part of this story is a bit hazy, but I suspect, and a few people suspect, that what happened is that the mink getting out coincided in the 1950s with the otter population of the UK suddenly plummeting. And the reason they plummeted was because of pesticides from the agricultural revolution, basically, post-war agricultural intensification. And my suspicion that is what happened is that the mink were getting out piecemeal from the cages they were being kept in and running straight into an otter. And otters do not like mink. People have found mink, killed with their testicles removed, which I think that's good. Have you heard that? Yeah. And I think that's an otter's way of telling you that they don't like you, essentially, that you're not welcome. So let that be a lesson to you. But of course, when the otter numbers plummeted, we got all of a sudden a very suspicious correlatedly increase in the number of mink, shall we say, and the mink have been here ever since. The next slide is missing, but it's a study from the 1990s which basically put the last nail in the coffin of the mink as being the perpetrator for the water voles decline, showing that in the North York Moors, wherever you got mink sign, you didn't get water vole sign. And the more mink sign you got, the fewer water voles you had. And this is just a sort of visual representation of what happened in the Thames Right, so my predecessor, Guillermo Burrito, worked on water voles in the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit in the early 1990s. And in 1995, these are the water vole records that we had, and we had a handful of American mink records. In the 1990s, when Guillermo was just starting, there were a few more mink and still a load of water voles. By 1995, when he was doing his PhD, the water voles were getting absolutely exterminated and the mink was spreading everywhere. His thesis became basically a real-time study of how water voles get exterminated from an entire river catchment. And now we have pockets of water voles, but you know, wherever we don't have mink. My own experience can show you exactly how quickly one American mink can take water voles. So this is the Wendover arm of the Grand Union Canal I showed you earlier. I studied that river for 3 years, sorry, that canal for 3 years. Each one of these brightly colored dots is where I caught a water vole in, I think, September 2001. When I came back in April 2002, there was one left. Because one female American mink had got onto the canal and evaded capture for the entire winter and took one water vole a day, every day for months. And that was it. That's the end of that population. American mink are the wrong animal in exactly the wrong place. They eat muskrats back home, and muskrats are about the same size as water voles, and they live by water. So they've already got a predilection for that sort of small, squeaky animals. They swim really well, faster than water voles do. Female American mink can fit down water voles' burrows and hunt them there. There is no escape from them on land. They hunt incredibly well on land. And the problem is that mink breed in the UK's winter, right when water voles are at their lowest population ebb, and they cannot recover from it. And you can imagine in this system here, here's the canal. If that mink had come from up here and is carrying on down there, there is nowhere for this population to be recolonized from, because water voles have been constrained to linear features, rivers and canals. A lot of farm wetlands and things like that have disappeared. And so once this population is gone, it's still gone. You just looked at a water vole population being annihilated by an American mink. So how does this all relate to conservation research? Well, this is a graph showing how conservation research works. Bold or what? Right. If you imagine this is the population size of your single species, and this is time as it progresses. So this is when everything's fine, and then something starts to happen, and you start to lose whatever, you lose bits of your population. And at this point, people start to think, hey, there's something wrong with this population, you know, this animal. And so there's research to sort of reveal the decline. And then we need research to diagnose what has happened, diagnostic research. And then we need, having understood the causes, then we need solution research. Okay, that happened, but how do we put it right? And once we've got the solutions, then we need management of the population to enact those solutions to make the population recover. And once it's recovered, you need sustainable management. Now, everything I've just told you about the water vole story gets us to here, basically. We know it was mink, we know what happened. How do we go about putting it right? And that was where I entered the story, wearing a variety of incredibly cool hats, sunburned, and basically getting urinated on for 8 years. Every time you pick up a water vole, it wheezes. Rob Strachan, who, bless him, is no longer with us. I saw him doing a photo shoot, and he had a water vole and he was posing, and he picked up the water vole for the camera and did that, and it weeds straight into his open mouth. And he was a proper professional. He didn't just put the world down. So by the time I'd done my PhD, we pretty much knew what a water vole population looked like and how things are going to work out. Oh, sorry, how, if we were aiming to put a population back, what it should look like. And so for my postdoc, which I'm going to tell you about now, What we wanted to know is, can we do it? Can we put water vole populations back, and what can we learn from that? And so we decided to do experimental reintroduction to water voles. So because, as our bosses was very, very, very fond of saying, it's difficult enough to be, it's interesting, but you have to be useful as well. And so it's, in terms of putting water voles back, it's not enough that we just go and put back populations of water voles right, left and center. We have to learn something from that. Otherwise, it isn't really research, and we may have just got lucky. So we had 12 replicate 800-meter lengths of river, 6 of which had wide margins of habitat, all that great stuff growing up out of the water, about 3 to 6 meters. And 6 had narrow margins, about 1 to 3 meters of plants growing up outside the water. And so we were basically testing the hypothesis that the more riparian vegetation you have, you're going to get a higher survival rate of the release cohort while the population is establishing, higher survival rates of the population densities once the populations are established. Basically, everybody thinks that reintroducing animals is an easy thing to do because it's conceptually very, very simple. You have a habitat from which animals have been extirpated. You have some animals you want to put back in it. That's their habitat. Those are the animals. Where's the problem? And the problem is that it's an acid test of how well you've understood the conservation problem. It's an acid test of how well you understand the species ecology. The modal outcome of reintroductions is that every single animal you put out there dies. That's what normally happens. If you get it right, that doesn't happen. Because you need to understand exactly what caused the thing to go extinct in the first place. You need to know what it eats, what behaviors it needs. You can't just run around shoving animals out right, left, and center, is what I'm trying to say. So what we did was we ran around shoving out animals right, left, and center and saw what happened. I joke. So we had 12 sites over the Upper Thames catchment. Over the course of 3 years, every single release took place in early May, just to give the population time to establish before the end of the breeding season. 44 individuals at each release site with a 1-to-1 sex ratio. So that's 536 foals we released in total over 3 years. And then once we'd let them go, we left them to it for a month. We came back every month for 5 months. And every single foal we put out had a grain of rice sized transponder in the scruff of the neck. So we knew who they were, how much they'd weighed, what sex they were. And then when we caught babies, we captured them, we weighed them, we marked them, and we kept doing that. And so we were able to establish population growth rates. Now, of course, none of that would be possible if we hadn't got rid of the mink. And it just so happened that this thing got invented at the right time. This is a mink raft. And before mink rafts were invented, if you wanted to know you had the American mink on your watercourse, you had to walk about 20 kilometers looking for little black mink scats or mink footprints in bits of mud, which is very, very, very laborious. And if you wanted to catch them, you had to put traps in places where you thought the mink would go. Turns out if you put a raft floating in the water, they just go and check it out. They do it for you. And they used to be, and you put a clay plate in the raft, it's in contact with the water in that tunnel, they run through it and they leave footprints. And just to show you the difference, those are mink tracks, those are water vole tracks. And then once you get mink tracks, you can replace the tracking plate with a trap and you can take the mink off the river. And so we worked very hard with a whole bunch of people to get the mink out of all of these sites for 5 kilometers upstream and downstream of our release sites, and to keep them that way before we could release any water voles, because there is 0 point putting water voles back somewhere where they're just going to get eaten by mink. And you'd think that is obvious, but I said the modal outcome of reintroductions is that everything dies. The main reason everything dies is because of a failure to have addressed the reasons they went extinct in the first place. You look at any of the literature and it's just like, honestly, how can this happen? But it does. So this is how water voles arrive on site. These guys have been bred up in captivity. Some of them have lived their whole lives in these lab cages. And that's something to bear in mind, that this is a rodent. So these are animals with very few learned behaviors. And you can do that. You can breed them up so that they've never seen a river, and you let them go, and all of those instinctive behaviors sort of kick in and they can survive. There are animals that have a lot of learned behaviors. If you take them from a zoo or breed them up in the zoo, you put them out, they're just going to die because they don't have the behavioral. You can't preserve behavior the way you can preserve genes, essentially. So anyway, so we're out on site. It's a lot of standing around trying to work out where they're all going. Before we let these go, a few weeks before, we went and we dug a bunch of these things in. These are release pens. They're 4 sheets of plywood sunk into the ground and with a cage over the top of it. The idea being, and there's a bale of hay in there, there's plenty of food and plenty of water. The idea being is you release the voles into there and they have to dig to get out. And then they've got a burrow to come back to. It's a soft release. Hard release would be you just take the cage, you let them go. And there's quite a lot of evidence if you do a hard release, they die. But a soft release, it just gives them a couple of days to adapt and out they go. And so we knew exactly where every single waterfall was going to go. You don't want to put 2 unfamiliar females into the same release pen because you would end up with one very badly damaged unfamiliar female at the end of it. They would fight. And this is a very, very rare sight in the British countryside. This is a happy farmer. This is a man called George, and George was absolutely fantastic. And this is a pop-up garden container. You know, I was telling you about Pringles tubes. And the pop-up garden containers are the other thing that made my life. You wouldn't imagine something like that could make your life amazing, but the fact that you could just empty a water bowl in there and then just kind of weigh them and measure them in there, that was just transformative. You have no idea. This is how they arrive in a release pen. That's what they look like in the Pringles tube. I know, isn't that? Makes my job so much easier. And then we scanned them. So you can basically shake them down, the tail comes out. You grab the tail, you pull, and then they sort of hang onto the tube, and then you can scan them with a reader that scans the transponder. You can weigh them, pose them for the cameras. This one's looking terrified, and I don't blame it. There he is on the way to the release pen, in the release pen, and you close the lid. And the really weird thing is that you arrive on site and there are release pens that we'd previously dug in. You leave the site and you've still got release pens, and they look exactly the same apart from the lids have been wired shut. And it was very odd because we had a lot of volunteers. We needed a lot of people to come and help us. And whenever we left the site, they were all looking at each other going, okay, well, what have we just done here? Because it looks exactly the same as when we arrived. But the incredible thing was that a month later, you get there, and sometimes the voles had gnawed straight through the side of the plywood. Sometimes they dug the way out like they were meant to. But you were seeing feeding signs, and you were seeing like runs through the vegetation, and you were seeing latrines, and they were starting to behave like wild water voles. And it was actually pretty emotional. It was kind of incredible. And then we were able to sort of go back and monitor. So I'm going to show you a few videos just to give you a feel for what it looks like going and trapping water voles after this. So this is this metal thing here. That's a trap. They kind of fold down and then they spring up into a box, and you put loads of apple and carrot in the back of that. And water voles love carrots and apple. They never get anything like that in real life, so normal life. So they go in, and then you've got water vole in a trap. And this is how you handle them.
Go on.
So this guy is just wondering what on earth is happening to him.
Come on, buddy, move.
So this is the scanner. There's no volume bit, it's okay. So that's the scanner to try and get hold of the transponder. So you can chase him around and try not to get bitten in the process. And there, the grooming there, that's stress grooming. Basically, he's telling me that I smell, and he doesn't want my smell all over him, so he's trying to get rid of that.
Starting to rain.
Yeah. There. So the next video is just to show you. So these guys have terrible eyesight, but really good sense of smell. So he's just trying to work out what's going on. So he's up on this orchard. So part of the reason for showing you these things is that people tend to think of species that are going extinct as being a bit weedy, or being lacking in some way. But this is a small rodent, and they're pretty feisty, and I have I have a big scar here from where a water vole bit through my fingernail. And, you know, the only way to get him off was just to hang there, let him hang there until he got bored. You know, I mean, they don't take a lot of messing about. And I know what you're probably asking yourself, which is, how do you get a water vole into a Pringles tube? This is how you get a water vole into a Pringles tube. There you go. Then you can stick them on scales. And I had one. She was lovely. And what I didn't realize before we started handling them this way, you know, before I was using nets, and they all reacted exactly the same way, that they all have, I hesitate to say personalities, but definitely personas. I had one female, she just, the biggest pain, because she was completely unafraid of me. And she would just turn around, come out of the tube, walk up my arm and sit there and look at me. And you're like, right, fine, but I'm trying to weigh you, you know. Whereas others, you know, were just constantly aggressive. So they all have very different ways of responding. And I want to show you one more video that makes a point. So these canes, we put them in front of the traps to basically mark where the traps are and to stop the traps from sliding down into the water, which is kind of important. If you work by water, you don't want the traps sliding into the water with an animal in it. And we accidentally left a couple of these canes in the pop-up container with the water vole because we weren't thinking. And this is what the water vole did with them. A little bit of a think. How we go. Time for a quick groom. And then it's Mission Impossible time. At this point, I realized I was about to lose some data and was like, let's get back in there. But you know, that animal would have been out of there in pretty short order. These guys are fantastically tough critters, and it's a sign of how badly we have treated them, ecologically speaking, that they have declined. I should have said, by the way, and I didn't, that the two national surveys of water voles, first one basically showed that we had lost water voles from about half of the UK. The second one, we lost water voles from another 67% of sites that had been occupied in the first survey in 1993. By 1998, we had lost another 67% of those sites were now empty. We lost 98% of our water voles over the course of about 3 decades. And that you know, now they are fantastically rare. So, you know, it was a rate of decline at the time that was faster than, you know, many rhino species, all because of one animal in the wrong place, the American mink. So what happened? So in terms of survival, by the end of May, we had 12 extant populations across any given year. We lost 3 almost immediately in over a couple of years. One, because there was a massive flooding event that swept the entire colony away, and most of the riverbanks went with it. 2, because the landowners that we were working with lost focus on the mink control, which is not their fault. Landowners are incredibly busy people. It's our fault for not ensuring that they were keeping up with it. We'd asked them to do us a favor, basically. And so these 2 losses here are definitely on us, as is this one, which occurred in the middle of June. There's nothing more depressing than going back to a water vole site and seeing rotting feeding sign and latrines that are beginning to disintegrate, and knowing that actually if you'd been there a month earlier, you could have prevented that. It's kind of horrendous. And then we lost another one over winter. So of our 12 releases, 7 were a success ultimately, and they've all spread, but we definitely could have done better. And again, it's exactly what we said. We failed to remove the original causes of decline. You know, I was saying, how can that happen? It happens very, very, very easily. The good news is we found a really strong relationship between the abundance of vegetation beside the river and the survival rates of the animals. We also found a really strong correlation between the vegetation abundance and population densities that you get. So the more width of vegetation you have beside the river, the better they survive, the higher the population density. I mean, this is not a surprising finding, but it's something that we didn't know until we proved it. What we also found is that when you had the narrow margins, so females used to rove about 83 meters away from where we let them go, and the males used to go about 152 meters away. Whereas when you had the wide margins, the females stayed put. They never went more than about 10 meters away from where we let them go. And the males never went more than 30 meters. So there's very clearly something there. You have wide margins, they just felt comfortable. Now, water voles don't feed outside of the first 1 meter beside the river pretty much. That's where they do all their feeding. So this is not about food, it's about shelter, because it's very difficult to hunt for an animal in 6 meters. You know, something the size of this, the width of this room, filled with reeds up to here, is extremely difficult to find an animal in. Whereas when they're constrained to that 1 meter, it becomes incredibly easy. And of course, what nearly all agricultural intensification does is it constrains the amount of land beside the river down to that 1 meter. And so we got a very clear argument that if you want to benefit, you know, wildlife in general probably, but water voles in particular, you need to open up those buffer zones alongside rivers. So in 8 out of 12 of our introductions to success originally, we lost another one as we're going on. And so, you know, we came to not surprising, but, you know, still valuable conclusions. You need to ensure the original causes of decline have been dealt with and get the habitat right. And with limited resources, that means if we're doing reintroductions, we need to target the best habitats available. So where does this leave us on our graph? So at this point, we've revealed the decline, we've done diagnostic research, we got the solution research, we know how to reintroduce water voles, we know we need to remove American mink, we know we can do it. Surely that is problem solved. The bill to save water voles is basically the same as saying, what's the bill to remove American mink? And a back of the envelope calculation by me is that it would be something like 60 to 100 million pounds. Do we have 60 to 100 million pounds to save water voles? No. And if somebody was to give me 60 to 100 million pounds and say, right, I want you to spend this on, you know, conservation in the UK, I probably wouldn't spend it on removing American mink. There are other goals that are equally underfunded that would have more bang for the buck. And so the problem is that the recovery management, this bit, didn't happen with water voles and still hasn't. I mean, so this research ended in 2012, and water voles are still declining. And we know how to save them, we just haven't. So then this is where this talk takes a bit of a handbrake turn. So what's the problem with water voles? Okay, they're ratty from wind in the willows. People love ratty from wind in the willows. Clearly not enough to stump up 60 to 100 million pounds, which is, you know, about £1 per British taxpayer, but, you know. So what about these guys? These are, you know, these are the top 10 most charismatic animals on the planet, as shown by sort of Wild Crew research and so these guys attract a load of funding. You might say they attract the lion's share of the funding, but that would be a terrible pun, and I don't do that. So what's their conservation statuses? These guys get a lot of money, and they're all in deep, deep, deep trouble in various ways. They don't get enough money to sort out their conservation. And, you know, as I'm sure you're aware, when you're into animals of this size, if you conserve these, you're conserving all sorts of other plants and animals, all sorts of species that co-occur in their ranges, and we're not doing it. So what's the bill? One possible aim of conservation could be to ensure that the loss of species, the rate of the loss of species is 0, i.e. no more species are lost in perpetuity. And one potential way of doing that is to set aside half of the terrestrial and half of the marine surface of the earth to just leave it to wildlife. What would be the bill for doing that? And the bill for doing that has been calculated. It was a few years ago now, so it'd probably be a bit bigger. But they reckon it's $100 billion every single year. That would be the bill to do global conservation properly. How much of $100 billion do we get per year? That much. That's about 4% of what we need to do global conservation properly, to stop any more plants and animals going extinct. Obviously, again, these are figures from various studies. They may have a big margin of error around them, but I think the point is fairly clear. Now, $100 billion sounds like a huge amount of money. I mean, good luck earning that in 2,000 or 3,000 years, you know. On the other hand, if you look at it in terms of other global enterprises, it's peanuts. That is 350 billion is how much the USA spends on soft drinks in a given year. Now, obviously, the markets for soft drinks and wildlife are very, very, very different things. If people didn't get soft drinks, they would be very, very angry and a lot more healthy. If people don't have wildlife, they will die, but they won't care. So none of that money can be used to pay for this. So, okay, let's look at things that are more commensurable. So how much are pollinators worth globally to global farming every single year? They're worth $600 billion. So if global farming cared about all the stuff that nature does for free, and they don't have to pay people to do this because it will cost them $600 billion, you know, to get out there and pollinate plants by hand, or how are they going to do it? Then they should stump up $100 billion to save nature, which is doing it for them. And you can go one step further. I mean, you could do this with fishing, you could do this with floods, flood risk, you could do this with global forestry, all of them. Any single usage of nature that is subsidized by stuff that nature does for free should stump up this money, any one of those, and put together the total ecosystem services we lose every single year due to not paying that is $4,000 billion, because we cannot find money to spend $100 billion. So that's a pretty disappointing conclusion to a talk about what conservation does. Does this mean that conservation research is useless? So in terms of my own career trajectory, a lot of my contemporaries did the same thing. I worked on water voles, then I worked on signal crayfish, another single species conservation problem, then I worked on hedgehogs, and then I gave up. I started working on people and doing surveys to see if I could change people's minds about how they consume the natural environment. And lots of people did exactly the same thing, because we realized that, you know, it doesn't matter what conclusions we come to, they're just not going to get enacted. And so a lot of people now are going for the low-hanging fruit, which is to try and stop people consuming nature the way they're consuming it, because you can work with that for very little money. It's not quite as depressing as it looks, though, because for water voles, there's in East Anglia a fantastic group called Water Recovery East have been working on mink crafts that have special sensors on them, that when a mink goes in, it will send you a text on your phone. And that means that one person can handle 100 mink crafts. And that gets a lot cheaper very quickly. And they have basically, working in a coordinated fashion with a number of partners and finding creative ways to find funds, they have exterminated mink from the entire of East Anglia and are pushing out into the rest of the UK. And they're taking this model and they're starting to apply it to other places. There is, in the Southwest, there are also places with no mink. There's a brilliant project in the Highlands that is removing mink, but it's very funding dependent. And so people, even though there is no governmental source where you go and you say, okay, listen, these are our findings, you know, give us some money and we'll sort this out. They never will. People are still doing it and they're finding ways to do it. And they couldn't have done that without the research. So there is definitely hope, there's definitely optimism. Water voles have come back to the Southwest. They're all over East Anglia and they're doing pretty well in bits of Scotland. But in the central UK, they're still gone. So there's a lot of hope. But so I'm giving you a slightly equivocal answer to the question of, you know, what does conservation do? It provides us with tools with which we can solve most of the world's problems in terms of, you know, in terms of wildlife. But unless we're willing to pick those tools up and use them, then we're in trouble. And however crafty we are, we're still up against, we need those other 96 billion. But anyway, thank you very much. I apologize for the depressing end to the talk, but it's still very worth doing. Thank you.